We are so excited to welcome Bridget Marquis virtually to University Circle. Bridget is the director of the Civic Commons Learning Network. Bridget is passionate about the potential for our public spaces to bring us together across divides and deliver social outcomes for cities. As project manager for Reimagining the Civic Commons, a national initiative supported by the JPB Foundation, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, and William Penn Foundation, she provides strategic advice, coordinated learning, impact assessment, and storytelling support to a network of communities seeking to transform shared civic assets to foster engagement, equity, environmental sustainability, and economic development. Under Bridget's leadership, the Civic Commons Learning Network developed a universal metrics framework to capture the multifaceted impacts of strategic investments in parks, libraries, trails, and community centers. A set of principles defining a new approach to managing public assets, and case studies offering examples of these practices at work. Building on Chris's great presentation about all the green spaces in and around the circle, Bridget will share her thoughts on the importance of our civic commons for our nation's recovery and how leading-edge civic leaders in cities across the country have started transforming networks of public spaces to connect people of all backgrounds, cultivate trust, and create more resilient communities. I'll turn it over to you, Bridget. Thanks for joining us.
Great. Good afternoon. Thanks for the warm welcome, Debbie and Chris. Let me just get my presentation up. There we go. Great. So when Chris and his team invited me to talk with you today, I was eager to say yes. Obviously, you have a lot of great things going there in University Circle. And amidst this global pandemic that has millions of Americans rarely leaving their homes, alongside mass protests being held from coast to coast against systemic racism and police brutality, the importance of a robust civic commons, of a connected system of high-quality public spaces that deliver real outcomes for communities has never been greater. Even before COVID-19, the US was in the grips of increased economic segregation, social isolation, and distrust. Trends from over the past 50 years show that we are more segregated by income than ever before. The proportion of American families living in predominantly low-income or predominantly affluent neighborhoods has more than doubled since 1970. And while racial segregation has declined somewhat across the US since 1990, in many cities it is still persistent and deep. We also don't know even those living closest to us. In the US, a full third of us don't interact with our neighbors at all. We've designed our communities in ways that make opting out of public life much easier than opting in. This at a time when health researchers are pointing to the direct link between social isolation and physical and mental illness, even premature death. And with our current physical distancing in place, this risk is only likely to grow. Meanwhile, trust in all institutions across the globe is in decline, and so is our trust in each other. 64% of US residents believe trust among fellow Americans is declining, and that this lack of trust makes it difficult to solve problems that require broad-based cooperation. Problems like COVID-19, problems like racial inequality. The separation and the growing distrust that it fosters are harmful. Growing segregation not only limits economic mobility and exacerbates inequities of place, but also reduces interactions between people of different races and incomes at a time when empathy and solidarity are key to our nation's recovery. And while these trends that worsen social isolation, tribalism, and distrust have grown, our civic assets, our parks, our trails, our libraries, and community centers, the very places that could bring us together, have suffered from disinvestment. Now, I would say University Circle is in a really great spot because it seems like you have been investing at a time when many haven't. Our gathering places come at the bottom of nearly every municipal budget across the country. They've been seen as nice to have, but not essential. And when budget cuts hit, they are often first on the chopping block. In fact, right now, parks departments in cities across the country are facing budget cuts up to 20%. And many of these departments were operating on shoestrings to begin with. As a nation, we have allowed our civic commons to erode. And now, when we need a robust, nature-rich public realm to stay healthy, in too many cities, it doesn't exist at the scale nor quality that we need. But what would a city look like that was putting every single one of its assets to work to connect people of all backgrounds, cultivate trust, and create resilient communities? This is a question at the heart of reimagining the civic commons. Reimagining the Civic Commons is a collaboration of the JPB, Knight, Kresge, and William Penn Foundations, alongside local partners, to revitalize and connect public spaces that exist in all of our cities. With a focus on our four main outcomes: civic engagement, socioeconomic mixing, environmental sustainability, and value creation, cross-sector teams in cities across the country are demonstrating that strategic investment in our civic assets is a smart way to start rebuilding the social fabric of our communities. The social fabric so necessary for empathy and trust to flourish, and to recover from the crises that we face. And let me pause here for just a minute on this outcomes slide. The outcomes orientation of reimagining the civic commons is what defines this work. Public space is one thing, and a robust civic commons where we share space with people whose lives are different than ours is another. We are committed to these outcomes, and the desire to achieve these outcomes guides everything that we do. This is public space work in service to more engaged, more equitable, and more environmentally and economically resilient communities. In short, we believe public spaces can be, in fact, must be a solution. COVID-19 and the civil unrest has only made the urgency of reimagining the civic commons even more apparent. Our public parks, plazas, trails, greenways, sidewalks, even our streets have become critical havens in cities. In communities across the country, these public spaces are sustaining people in ways we'd never contemplated, even a few months ago. As these headlines show, Americans have developed a newfound appreciation for the value of the civic commons. As we practice physical distancing, a growing number of people now see that public spaces provide fresh air, reduce stress, and much needed moments of interaction with our neighbors. Important activities that we used to take for granted. At the same time, recent events have also revealed enormous disparities in the quality and welcoming nature of these public spaces. It's no surprise that signature parks and trails have been packed at this time. For current demand for high quality public space clearly outsizes the supply in many cities. For in far too many neighborhoods with playgrounds and basketball courts shuttered for public health reasons, what's left of the public realm? Often not a whole hell of a lot. There is no place to safely exercise, for kids to play outside or experience nature. And too often our public spaces are not safe and inviting to all. So while we can't take for granted our signature parks and trails, we also cannot allow the right to high quality public spaces to be limited only to those who can afford to live near one or who look like me. During this recovery, we must lift up a welcoming and robust civic commons as a universal right for every resident in every neighborhood, in every city. We need to invest in our shared public spaces. But to make these investments wisely means reimagining not just the places themselves, but fundamentally changing how we design, manage, and operate these assets. Central to reimagining civic commons approach is the belief that by managing our shared public spaces as a portfolio of assets focused on four key outcomes, we can strengthen communities and ultimately our democracy. From our initial demonstrations, we've developed a set of 9 principles, as well as a metrics framework that Debbie mentioned earlier, that have an eye on impact. And you can get these for free on our website. I'm not going to spend the time running through them today. But from the last 4 years of work, what I wanted to bring to you are some case studies. We have good examples of approaches to public space that deliver on equity and resilience. So one model comes from Memphis, where over the past few years, a collaboration of public and nonprofit partners has transformed a 6-city block area adjacent to downtown and the Mississippi River, now called the Fourth Bluff, into a series of connected, vibrant, and dynamic civic spaces. So first, the context. Memphis is a city starkly divided by race and income, with a poverty rate that has stayed stubbornly high. Compounding these divisions, there are too few places where Memphians of different backgrounds come together and share space as equals. That's why a focus on creating opportunities for interaction across diversity is at the core of the Civic Commons work. Especially in cities with deep segregation, public space must be designed, managed, and operated to intentionally welcome people of all races and backgrounds. A lesson Memphis has learned through the thoughtful reimagining of a branch library, a trail, and 2 parks on its riverfront. And they're just getting started. So what does this focus on outcomes look like in practice? Let's zoom in on one asset that has been transformed. So you'll see it in front of you now, what started as an uninspired, underused park that was right next to the Mississippi River. It was named after Jefferson Davis, yes, president of the Confederacy in a majority minority city. So it was completely reimagined. It was renamed, redesigned, reopened in late 2018 as River Garden. This park has become a go-to place in Memphis, with a dining and events pavilion and all ages play and adventure structure, natural meadow plantings, fire pits, a snack shack, swings, hammocks, tables, and differently scaled conversation spaces. It is successfully attracting more people than ever before, with average visitor numbers up more than 300%. And results of intercept surveys among visitors show that the park's users hail from a wide range of socioeconomic backgrounds and from a diverse geography of more than 40 different zip codes. When it comes to delivering outcomes, design matters. It's clear that UCI has spent time and been intentional about design. So Memphis's River Garden was redesigned in a way that clusters a variety of activity into one portion of the park. This encourages more interaction among visitors and increases the opportunity for people of different backgrounds to connect as they climb on the treehouse, swing on the hammocks, or grab a cup of coffee from the Fourth Cup coffee stand. While many public spaces seek to separate users and activities, Memphis successfully works to bring people together. Even during this time of necessary physical distancing, the design of the park encourages friendly exchange while staying 6 feet apart. Staffing is another opportunity to advance outcomes. In River Garden, former park maintenance staff have been retrained as park rangers, an experience-focused team who are charged with greeting each and every visitor and making the parks welcoming for everyone, in addition to their daily maintenance tasks. Rangers proactively ask if they can improve visitors' experience and are knowledgeable about programs, events, and surrounding downtown businesses. These team members are now being paid higher wages for this value-added work, and new positions have been created for advancement to supervisory roles, with the ambition that this field team truly reflect the diversity of Memphis. With these new organizational responsibilities, employees have embraced their role to create an elevated experience in public space, one where people mix across social, economic, and neighborhood divides, and where all Memphians feel welcomed and valued. In terms of civic engagement, Memphis believes in the importance of inviting community members in, not just as consumers, but as shapers and stewards of the Fourth Bluff. In River Garden, local elementary, middle, and high school students designed, prototyped, and built life-size birds' nests crafted from Mississippi driftwood for the space right when it was opening. And a future park transformation currently in the planning process has high school students from core city neighborhoods working alongside the design team of Studio Gang and Scape, enabling them to gain resume building skills and providing valuable insight on the park's future. Additionally, the team has recruited more than 70 community members to serve as ambassadors who volunteer at events, participate in service projects, and donate and raise money to support the public space efforts. Free programming. Chris, you mentioned programming. I think it's really important. That's another way to bring together diverse neighbors. For the Memphis team, every program or communications decision that is made is interrogated as to whether it appeals across race, income, and age. by focusing on regularly occurring programs, daily or weekly or monthly, with low or non-existent barriers to entry, such as yoga classes, salsa dancing, roller skating, basketball, and concerts. They have drawn a racially and economically diverse audience to their sites. With free kayak rentals and lessons available on the riverfront every day, Memphians without access to boats can see the city from the water, often for the very first time. The team is also working to connect adjacent neighborhoods to increase opportunity across districts. This seems like something that UCI is also thinking about. So while adjacent to downtown, the zip codes surrounding the Fourth Bluff and the adjoining riverfront are home to 39% of children living in poverty in Memphis. The Memphis team is leading efforts to redefine pedestrian and cycling corridors between the riverfront and surrounding neighborhoods. They're also working to bring much needed attention to the long overlooked MLK Park, which is south of downtown, to use that as an anchor for new investment in the adjacent neighborhood. As more and more people cross paths at the Fourth Bluff, the Civic Commons is bolstering a sense of shared identity, creating connections among people of diverse backgrounds, and advancing a more equitable Memphis. And another model comes from just down the road from you in Akron, Ohio, where a wide collaboration that crosses silos and sectors, including residents, is reimagining the Civic Commons. With investments in 3 neighborhoods and the Ohio and Erie Canal towpath trail that connects them, Akron is knitting together isolated communities through collaborative reimagining of public places. Temporary and permanent design features and regular programming are reestablishing the 100-acre Summit Lake as a place of civic pride and play, bridging diverse neighborhoods, including Ohio and Erie Canal Park, and fostering economic development and public life in Akron's downtown. I'm going to just quickly tell you the story of Summit Lake. Some of you may already know this since you're in Ohio too. So just 2 miles south of downtown Akron on the Ohio and Erie Towpath Canal is a 100-acre glacial lake. In the 1920s, it was known as Akron's $1 million playground and attracted thousands of visitors to the amusement park along its banks to swim, picnic, and boat. But after being used as an industrial waste site by the rubber industry, Summit Lake fell into disuse and developed a reputation as a place to avoid. The adjacent neighborhood has also suffered from decades of isolation and disinvestment. As such, distrust grew. Akron Civic Commons began its project by listening, really deeply listening, to Summit Lake neighbors and understanding their ideas for improving the neighborhood. In listening, they heard of decades of things being done to and not with, and things promised and not delivered. So to ensure that that wouldn't be the case this time around, the team's process has centered on co-creation and co-stewardship. Residents are actively part of the team. The project team knew that changing residents' perceptions of the lake would be a key part of the restoration process. Many people nearby saw the lake as dangerous. In fact, in the very early stages of the efforts, neighborhood residents requested that a fence be put up all around the lake. They saw the lake as a liability, not as a community asset. Luckily, instead of a fence, the early listening sessions led to relatively inexpensive and early investments in prototype improvements around the lake. A new beachhead with improved facilities for fishing, canoeing, and kayaking, swings, shade umbrellas, and outdoor grills. They put residents' ideas into action quickly and provided tangible evidence of their role as producers of this civic space. This act of co-creation is generating trust. Similarly, the team pilots programming. Again, thinking about it in terms of kind of daily, weekly, monthly rituals, with residents and neighborhood organizations taking the lead. So a photography apprenticeship program for neighborhood youth over the last 2 years has evolved into one for residents of all ages. There's a weekly farmers market and a paid ambassador program to hire individuals from the neighborhood to help steward the space on a regular basis. A pop-up nature center hosts after-school programs, children's fishing lessons, and guided canoeing and kayaking on the lake. They're trying to make this lake and the park nearby a daily place to visit. So this pop-up nature center that I mentioned has compelled the countywide Summit Metro Parks to transform an old pump house that had sat vacant for years into the Summit Lake Nature Center. This is under construction right now. a permanent home for Metro Park staff at Summit Lake. This is one of Summit Metro Park's first forays into investing in a City of Akron public park. It's a huge win for the neighborhood and hopefully a model for future co-investment. So the approach of pilot projects followed by permanent investments has been very successful. And again, they're doing that both in terms of capital investment and program. It's been successful at engaging residents and creating a series of small wins of which the entire neighborhood can be proud. Community members have come to see Summit Lake Park as their own, in part because they created it together. And at the same time, Summit Lake is attracting more visitors from the rest of the city and beyond. The work is also yielding greater civic engagement as residents have gained a renewed sense of agency. After seeing the success at Summit Lake, residents proposed and led the creation of a memorial garden in the neighborhood on a previously vacant lot. Neighborhood resident Secoria Finney brought this space to life and has built a team of local stewards to tend to it regularly. Here's the garden that's in bloom now on its first anniversary. And overall, this work is changing perceptions in Akron. A whopping 94% of Summit Lake residents believe that the nearby neighborhood has a bright future. Really stunning for a neighborhood that has faced decades of disinvestment. Last September, Summit Lake even hosted the Akron Marathon for the very first time. It's removing the stigma that's been there for generations. The approach is working. In fact, I would say it's been nothing short of transformational. Along with success in reimagining specific public spaces, Akron's work is also having system-wide impact. In order to ensure a more holistic approach to planning and development that prioritizes public space and public life, Mayor Horgan created the Office of Integrated Development. With representation from engineering, planning, recreation, and economic development, it's really silo busting within the city. So with OID's strategic framework, Akron now has a blueprint for starting to work smarter together to build and sustain an Akron that is healthy, equitable, beautiful, and resilient, with public space and public life at its heart. This is exactly the type of system change we need today, one that recognizes the interconnectivity of our shared public assets and our shared prosperity. This is a framework for recovery. So now is a critical moment for our communities and for our country. The economic crisis spurred by this pandemic and the civil unrest from centuries of systemic racism make it a time when we must reconsider what we prioritize. We have an opportunity right now to reinvent the places where our paths cross with people of all backgrounds, where a shared sense of identity is created, social capital is multiplied, and our empathy for others is bolstered. I believe what we invest in coming out of this crisis will define our generation. Will we invest in more highways and walls that divide us, or in the civic infrastructure that can yield more equitable and resilient cities? What will be our legacy? The decision really is up to us. As the country begins the discussions of recovery, we all must be ready to make the case that our public spaces are critical infrastructure. Our very success in fighting for equality and preparing for future pandemics and related threats like climate change depends upon more trust, more collaboration, not less. We desperately need civic infrastructure that rebuilds trust, that helps our economic recovery, and builds a belief in a better future for every single member of our communities and of our nation. I believe a robust civic commons is the work of all of us. And with the challenges we face today, I can't think of anything more urgent. Now more than ever, we need our civic commons. Thank you.
Thank you, Bridget. A couple of minutes there, we were just getting our technology back here at UCI. I want to thank you. I'm sure virtual thanks across the city and our folks from around other cities in the nation that have joined. wanted to first tell you right out of the gates, the very first question we got wasn't a question, it was a comment from one of our board members and neighbors from the city of East Cleveland, Adata Letson, who said, "Bridget Marquis rocks." That came in as a text. So thank you, you do. And you were, we were lucky to see you at the national conference that we did by, again, digital technology, and Bridget emerged just as somebody we thought had the most timely message to what we're talking about in terms of everything. We're right now, and you referenced in a pre-call the words, our moment of truth. And I think that marriage of your walk-away question of what will be our legacy from our moment of truth, now is the time, right, to be doing the work that you're talking about. I want to also welcome on the line from the Group Plan Commission. There's a few members that have worked on the detailing of Public Square. Sana Julian was on this call, and if she's still on, I want to thank her. They intentionally, with the design of Cleveland's Public Square, the most central space in Cleveland, intentionally designed in a speaker's terrace to basically honor the democratic values of the right of free speech on the Public Square. And I thought that was a great testament to what Cleveland stands for. But the work and the sort of show me will be in how our future and how we exercise that right on that public space. I have so many questions, some other questions that have come in from others, so I'm going to juggle those that are coming in and a few that our team staff has had here. And I want to encourage everybody who wants to ask a question in the next few minutes. We've got about 20 minutes of Bridget's time. Fire away on the chat question that you can find right here on your screen. Well, I want to ask you, and first of all, you picked up on so many important points, the idea of co-creation and co-stewardship, that sort of shared from beginning to end value. You know, what I wanted to ask you is, you with Memphis and with Akron, and kudos to both cities, but particularly our near neighbor to the south and Mayor Horstman's work to create that integrated committee, but also that idea of committee of citizens with the voice. And when I say integrated, I mean departmentally integrated, because we work too many times in silos across city departments and lose sight of the big picture. Saying that as a former planning director and chief of staff. But let me ask you, the sort of first inning of the game in co-creation and co-stewardship, how does it best begin? Some of our staff members had many questions about resident engagement, the community planning process period. What have you seen the best of in terms of getting to co-creation and then evolving to co-stewardship?
Yeah. So I think what we've learned from Civic Commons was that setting forth those 4 outcomes as critical, that's what you're working towards, right? You're not actually, public space is kind of the means to get there as opposed to the ends. I think that is, first off, really important. So having just everyone who's on the collaboration, everyone on the team, really buy into those 4 outcomes has been essential to the work. In terms of co-creation and getting it started, Akron did a really good job of just humbly going out and listening and inviting people in ways that allowed them to participate in the reimagining, right? So they did a lot of dinners, a lot of, they did door knocking. They took kind of any opportunity they could to bring residents out of their homes and into Summit Lake Park, which was not some stunning location at the time, just to understand what it was that was kind of inhibiting them from using that space and what scared them about the lake. So I think going in with really deep listening and being humble is really important. I think the co-stewardship, I'm going to be honest, is sort of a work in progress right now. So the teams that we're working with, we had 5 demonstration teams and recently announced another 5 that are joining the Learning Network as expansion cities. And I think all of them are working through what that model of co-stewardship can look like over the long term, and trying to define what is the role of city government, what is the role of nonprofit organizations, and then what is the role of residents in a long-term stewardship plan. So I would say it's not fully worked out, but I think the invitation to steward, lots of people want that invitation. It's just not offered so often, right? But you need to make the ask in a way that they can tangibly see what they're doing is good for them, good for the neighborhood, good for the public space. And I think people really enjoy that level of civic engagement. So I would say, don't think about it as community engagement or community kind of process. Think of it as how is what we're doing advancing civic engagement in this community. And I think that leads you in a good direction.
You're inspiring us to pursue an idea that we've talked about here at University Circle Inc. I have had, as many of our partners on this line have had, we've had formal contracted ambassadors, if you will, groups like Block by Block out of Louisville that have, obviously presented places like Cleveland with a great service. But what we've thought about is engaging and paying, resident ambassadors in that work, and also junior ambassadors in that work. And there's also elements of volunteer work we're seeing actually all along the Rockefeller Park corridor. God bless the residents who get out and are literally helping with the maintenance of the commons. Nobody's asking permission, nobody's asking forgiveness. They're just doing it, and we should give them a neighborhood leadership award too. I mean, this idea of stewardship is so powerful, but it strikes me that it's got to begin with being a participant in the planning process, seeing through the project, to have equity and ownership in it, to be the steward of the future. It seems like a great idea.
But I would also say you've got a lot of beautiful sites that I think there are other ways to do it, even if you can't start at the beginning, right? And to say that you have to start at the beginning to get there, I think is unfair.
Fair enough.
And so I would say start where you start and just start being really intentional about what the invitations are that you're making. I think that paid ambassadorship programs are really smart. It gives you stewards, but you're also building wealth in neighborhoods and making those connections stronger.
Absolutely. And well, thank you for that. And like you said, get going where you can get going. And we've got some spaces that are Olmsted designed 150 years old, but let's just move on it now. I wanted to ask you, a couple of questions came in about budgets and park budgets and making the case for support for parks in these most complicated times financially. Obviously, munis have been hard hit. I was intrigued with the Mayor of Akron's departmentally integrated approach to this, because I also know we have a former parks director from the city of Cleveland on the line here who said, come budget time, why am I the one who's always cut? Everything else is put up in front on the service side except parks themselves. How do you make the case for support financially for parks and green spaces in this financially complicated era we're in?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully I just did. But I think that I don't think that Parks and Recreation and libraries, I don't think we've done a good job of making that case, right? I don't think we've collected the data that we need to collect. So that's part of our work too, is this outcomes orientation, and we're collecting metrics that focus on those 4 outcomes, start to collect to understand how it's building trust, how it's, increasing value in neighborhoods. You got to make the economic argument, you've got to make the societal argument. And I think too often we're measuring outputs, acres mowed and books in circulation, these metrics that don't tell a story. They're not compelling to anyone outside of that department. And I think we've just not created the kind of outcomes orientation that we need through those departments to tell the compelling story. I think what's fascinating is you go out across the country, and so often parks levies will pass, libraries levies will pass. People are willing to pay more in tax dollars to go to these civic assets, but we're not making the case to our internal decision makers, right? So the public's willing to pay. It's just we need to get better at telling our story and using compelling data and doing our work as best as we can with the limited budgets that we currently have. And then the third thing I will say is I think now's the time to be really organized and making the case for federal dollars, right? Every city municipal budget is strapped right now. That's not going to change in the next 2 years for certain. And we know there's going to be stimulus dollars flowing. There already are. It's going to keep coming. There's likely going to be an infrastructure package. This, all of us working around public space need to come together, form a coalition, and start to advocate at the national and federal level to view these assets as civic infrastructure.
Right.
That's just as important as roads and bridges.
Right. You've got us at hello on that one here at UCI. I mean, it is green infrastructure, greenways, parks and green spaces, it's every bit as important as the roads, bridges, sewers. And we hear you. And that, going back to that Holly White comment, if you plan for cars and traffic congestion, you get what you get, right? What about a plan for people? UCI's, I'm happy to report, years ago, it was the students who brought us to organizationally that conscience to think about places for people when there was actually a circular Autobahn planned for a small 1 square mile space as University Circle. It just was the era we were in. Hopefully we're in an era where we're at an era of green space and realizing the equity in that. We have a number of people thrilled by Akron, so I'm going to suggest to the multitude of people who put the lens on Akron that we bring Akron to our conversation in the near future. I want to go to one of our board members' comments. I'm just going to paraphrase it a little bit, but has to do with how an organization can launch a comprehensive vision with priorities for enhancement of these spaces. I think the spirit of that is mentioned, all in, there's nearly a square mile of green space in a space that's only about as much bigger in terms of a neighborhood. So our ratio of green space to hardscape is pretty strong. Having said that, how do we prioritize among these spaces where to make investment? I'm going to hedge a little and say I think we need to think about that final mile or final block to neighborhoods, because we got all these neighborhoods lining green space, but there are barrier disconnects, Rock Park being one of those. Go ahead.
Yeah, so obviously I don't know the geography other than what you showed me in Cleveland that well, but I promise I'll make a stop next time I'm out in Akron to see it in person. But I do think the connections, the physical connections and the kind of mental map connections to neighborhoods are really important, right? So how do you create the invitation both physically through design, through connected greenways, et cetera, into neighborhoods so that they are physically invited? And then I think, the ambassador program, the program, how you actually come about what the program is going to be, how regularly are you, hosting or making that invitation. I think that's the other piece that's really critical to get community engaged in ways that they are seeing the immense amount of green space that they have in their kind of backyards, but may not feel like it's theirs. Yeah. And may not feel that level of invitation on a regular basis to do that. I think in terms of priorities, the other thing I would say is a lot of the work that is being done through Civic Commons is the kind of, obviously they're doing capital project work, but a lot of the work is the kind of program, the change in staffing models, like just being really thoughtful about operating toward outcomes as opposed to, again, kind of seeing public space as the end. And I think that mind shift switch makes you prioritize things differently than you would otherwise.
When you spoke about Civic Commons, I'm intrigued by the numbers of cities that I think through Knight Foundation and Kresge, some of your funding, your partners, many foundation partners, it looks like, how you found these cities or how they found you, because I'm sure Cleveland's got Akron envy, although we're a wonderful region, but how do we find you, and how did you come across working with the specific cities you're working with? And maybe you can name a few beyond Memphis and Akron that you're working in.
Yeah, so the 10 cities involved, so we had 5 demonstration cities. It actually started with a pilot program in Philadelphia back in 2015. And that was a collaboration between Knight Foundation and William Penn Foundation investing in civic assets in Philadelphia. And then we expanded as a national initiative in 2016 and added Akron, Chicago, Detroit, and Memphis at that time. And now we've just expanded the learning network to this set of 5 expansion cities, which are Lexington, Kentucky, Macon, Georgia, Minneapolis, you can tell I haven't listed this one as often, Miami, and San Jose. We have definitely had a process where we did invitation-only system. Obviously, funders that were involved were very deeply engaged in who got the invitation for various reasons, but also really wanted to make sure that these teams that wanted to engage in this work were first off committed to those 4 outcomes, right? As I said, they really do guide the entire spectrum of work. Had a portfolio or kind of a pipeline of public space work that seemed like it could be well informed by the process of reimagining the Civic Commons. And then third, we're really deeply interested in learning. The entire initiative really is built around, I run the Learning Network. Learning is central to the whole thing. It's not as though we come at it and say, oh, here are the best practices, let's go implement them, especially right now, right? There are no best practices when it comes to recovery from a pandemic. And so I think that has been really critical to who's been engaged and how we kind of proceed with those teams. Is just making sure that they're committed to outcomes, that they have a set of projects that are in the works or coming online that they can work on and implement things through, and then that they really want to learn.
Yeah.
So a lot of the work is about cross-city learning.
I love that. It's learning across the city and committed to the outcomes from a leadership standpoint. That's great. Question from the field out here. We've got one that for a park that's more of a regional attraction than a neighborhood park, what are some of the best tactics you've seen for increasing usage by more proximate neighbors?
Yeah. So one example I would give is Barbs Garden in Philadelphia. So they were part of the original pilot in Philadelphia, and we'll continue doing work there over the next 3 years with this next phase of Civic Commons. Maitre Roy took over as executive director there, and I can't remember the year, but a healthy handful of years ago, and really shifted the mission of that institution. So it's the oldest botanical garden in the country. It had always kind of brought in people who were interested in gardening, you know, the birding community, kind of people who were not from Southwest Philadelphia. And so it had been this regional attraction for really since the beginning. And people who lived in the really adjacent, right? There's a significant public housing development that's literally right next door. And when Maitre first became director, you know, assumed that all these neighbors must go there, and kind of went out to the community, asked them questions. I mean, half of them didn't know it was there. You know, the other 40, another 40% said, well, that's private. Like we can't go there. They didn't even know it was a public asset. And so just stepping out of whatever that asset is into community and really getting the conversation going. She also hired early on kind of community organizers to be part of her staff. So people who are really comfortable working in neighborhoods to kind of be that liaison to go beyond the border of the park and then start inviting people in. Now they do lots of kind of community driven, again, programming. They've built a part of a trail that will connect all the way into Center City in the coming years. And they do a community food program through like a gardening program. So there's just a lot of different aspects now. But I would say the first step was just kind of getting out of the asset and talking to the folks in the neighborhood.
Terrific. I think we've got, interestingly, in University Circle, a tale of two parks. We've got one that's a regional/local park that there's this wonderful alchemy of residents and regionalists that are coming in for things like our concert. And then we have a park nearby, Rockefeller Park, where I think there's been understandable consternation over the years by residents that we're disconnected from it, and we need to be better connected. So we might have a nice opportunity working with our neighborhood partners like Famicos up in Glenville to better connect on the issue of Civic Commons in the park. I want to ask you about Civic Commons. We are familiar with the term in Cleveland in so many ways. There's actually an organization, Civic Commons. There's been, I think for all intents and purposes, our city club is a Civic Commons of dialogue and exchange. There's all kinds of digital commons, but there really hasn't been a press for public space as Civic Commons in its name. We've had the Department of Parks and actually the City of Cleveland then as one of the New York City Parks Commissioner who came in to speak at the Cleveland City Club a while ago said, but then you got rid of it. It's not even on your website. It was sort of lost into some other city department. We might have an opportunity, and I'm going to fold sort of two questions into one because there's been a lot of questions offline on this leadership question. We might have an opportunity in a next mayoral or next county election to ask the question, what of the Civic Commons of the future, and sort of probe it as a platform issue for candidates as they come through over the next year where there's a mayor's election coming up. Might look as close by as Akron with Mayor Horgan about what he's been doing, but where would you tell us as a community to begin to put that in the civic dialogue, to recognize Civic Commons as civic space, and maybe make it a platform issue for mayoral aspirants?
Yeah. So I think the coalition building is one way to start, right?
Mhm.
So I think you're right. Silos exist in every city, right? I think the Office of Integrated Development in Akron is a desire to bust those silos in order to deliver better outcomes in neighborhoods. And I think there's no doubt in my mind that delivering public goods through silos cannot possibly be the most efficient, nor the most effective, nor the most inspired way to do it. So another example I would give you is out of Detroit. So Detroit, kind of after going through bankruptcy, they rebuilt their planning department. And you'll like this, Chris, that it's coming out of planning. And that planning department really had a different kind of ambition for the city. And they started looking at neighborhood investment, right? So they had kind of a downtown that was humming, that was working, that was being invested in, and yet a sea of neighborhoods that had not seen investment in decades. And so part of the work in Detroit began kind of the silo busting inside of City Hall and then really connecting with outside sectors. So they developed something called the Strategic Neighborhood Fund, where it's this public-private philanthropic, nonprofit kind of layering of investment. Originally it was in 3 neighborhoods where they were doing these pilots. One was a Civic Commons neighborhood called Fitzgerald, and now they've expanded it to 10 neighborhoods across the city. But the emphasis there is really on equitable neighborhood development with kind of, originally it was 3 pillars, none of which were public space. But through the investment of Civic Commons work in Fitzgerald, public space became the 4th, right? Really strong emphasis on the public realm, creating this kind of 20-minute neighborhood, thinking about commercial districts, doing a greenway and a neighborhood park, streetscaping, just really thoughtful that it wasn't just about the Parks Department, right? In fact, the Parks Department wasn't in the lead. Planning was in the lead, kind of quarterbacking it across sectors, across silos, and they were starting to recognize that so many times to make investments, you're investing in sidewalks over here in this neighborhood, you're investing in a park here, but there's no sidewalk to get to it, right? So this alignment of departments and of ambition means that you're able to stretch a dollar, of which we aren't going to have as many as we used to, further. And so I think part of the kind of advocacy effort needs to be that public space delivers more than many different social, economic, and environmental outcomes can be delivered through public space. And second, that when you do it in a layered, multi-sector, multi-departmental way, you can deliver way more with less.
Yes. It's inspiring. I'm thinking about, sticky cultures of longstanding legacy cities with, bureaucracies that I've been a part of. We've all, been experiencing it with our cities, but this new way of thinking with integrated departments, it's really a watershed opportunity. I want to ask you on the management side, you talk about co-creation and co-stewardship. Have you seen or do you see in the future management by residents? And I say that as a CDC that manages a park through a management agreement with the city. That's sort of formal, but do you see almost in a community garden way, taking it to a larger level where neighbors are actually managing the space of the future?
Yeah, I think it's a big question right now, is to figure out what the breakdown is between what the public sector should be delivering, right? And I think that's the trick there, is that if you take too much off of public sector's plate, and that becomes the new norm. And then when you need them to step in to do something, they don't have the capacity anymore. And so there's a balancing back there, right? Where you want, resident stewards, yes, but you also know that you have to keep a layer of they need to stay in the game. The public sector needs to stay in the game.
I appreciate that.
Too often, I think we have sort of allowed public space to be completely managed by nonprofits, by external organizations outside of the public sector, because they're usually more efficient and can do higher quality than what public sector says they're able to invest. And I think the long-term risk there is that the public sector loses its public space muscle.
Yes.
And there's often not the kind of capacity, organizational capacity, for that to be an equitable system across the city. So kind of this is a huge question for the field. How do you balance the role between nonprofits that clearly have a good role to play, the public sector that needs to build probably more muscle, and then the residents, and make sure that everyone is receiving equitable public space.
I think that's wonderful. I know that many members of our board will appreciate that, because that has been true here, even in the circle, that as we've taken on more responsibility, there's a yin and the yang to that, and there's a disappearance of other sectors. Maybe the art is really in the partnership of the citizen sector with the public administration sector and the nonprofit sector as a collaborative, back to the Friends and the Conservancies and the groups that are stewarding, to your point. We're running short on time, but boy, I wish we had another 90 minutes with you. Where can we find out more about the work that you've been talking about, online or otherwise, Bridget?
Yeah, definitely. So our website is www.civiccommons.us. From there, you can kind of connect to all of the resources I mentioned. We have a very live, every other week publication going out over Medium that you can link to from there to get kind of stories from the ground and what we're seeing across the country. So I encourage you to go there. We're on Facebook and Twitter at Civic Commons US.
Terrific. And Bridget, when the time is appropriate, you did promise me a visit to Cleveland when you're on your way to Akron. Send us some of your time. We're grateful for you spending your time with us today and your insights. Congratulations on the work you do. I know that we know how to get a hold of you, and if anybody wants to get a hold of Bridget that doesn't have a direct connection, although she just gave you a number of ways, let us know at UCI and we'll connect you. Bridget, thanks for the time today. Any parting thoughts or words for us?
Just keep up the great work, and I can't wait to see you in Cleveland next time I'm in town.
Here's to that. Bridget Marquis and all friends who joined today from here in Cleveland and around the country, thanks for joining us for UCI's 2020 summer meeting. Be safe, be healthy, and stay positive. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you, Bridget.